Alright guys, quick one today. We are going to learn how to animate a texture on an object. This is really simple, relatively speaking. Really cool thing to add to your models if you want to have some sort of movement or point of interest without actually animating much with the object itself. So as you can see, I've got a little control here with a little slider attribute, and when I increase the value or decrease the value, I can slide the texture, and I can keyframe that as I want to as well. So if I want to, I can put down a keyframe on that that slider attribute, go to my next frame, and when I play it back, it's animating. So let's get going. Alright, so for this I'm just going to use I'm just going to repeat this process for you guys just to see how it's done. To do that, I'm just going to make a simple polyplane. I'm going to bring it down just to make it easier for you to see. Scale it up, move it across. I'm going to decrease my subdivisions, and that's all I'm going to make. Alright, so what do I have to do next? Firstly, I'm going to freeze my transformations. I'm going to freeze those, and I'm going to delete the history just to keep it clean. Alright, so next step, pretty simple. We're just going to add a material to this. New material. I'm going to give it a redshift shader for now. And now I'm going to apply a texture to that. So I'm going to go to my material node here. I'm going to push in the color attribute, I'm going to add a texture, and I'm going to add a file. Navigate to the file I want to use. I'm going to use the same texture. So in this case, I have an escalator sort of styled texture. And as you can see right now, it looks completely different to the way I have it set up here. Now, that's for a few reasons. Firstly, I haven't unwrapped this polygon. I haven't UV unwrapped this. Secondly, the direction of this texture is in the wrong direction because of the fact that I haven't unwrapped it and positioned the UVs properly for this piece. So, for something as simple as a polyplane like this, it's pretty straightforward. As you get into more complicated sort of meshes, depending on how you want the texture to animate, you'll have to unwrap your mesh accordingly. But for this demonstration, pretty straightforward. So if I go over to my UV editor, I've got it open over here, you'll notice that I have the bounds of my polyplane, and the texture is visible there as well. Now, all I have to do now, because it's so simple, is unfold this polygon plane. So I have to UV unwrap it, so I'm going to push unfold, and notice how it's now the same proportion. It's taken on the same proportion of this polygon. If it was a more complicated mesh setup, you'd probably get a different sort of outcome depending on your model, but you basically now have to reposition this UV or your UV to match the direction in which you want your texture to animate. So in our case, you'll notice that 1, the direction is in the wrong way, and 2, the scale of the texture is way too big, like massively big for this object. So let's see what happens when I start editing the UV. So I'll just zoom in there. Now if I go to rotation, in the UV map, I'm going to choose the shell, and I'll select the shell. Now if I start rotating my UV, you'll notice that the texture seemingly rotates into place. The actual fact is that we're rotating the polygon the unwrapped UV of our polygon, not the other way around. But notice how the scale is still way too big, and it's in the middle. Well, that's a simple solution. We just have to scale up our UV. Now notice how when we scale things up, our UV is stretching out beyond the bounds of our UV texture map. Well, what really happens is when even though you have these empty grids, what's actually going to happen with this texture is that it's going to start repeating along the polygon or along the UV. So we can actually use that to our advantage. So I'm going to place my UV into place like so. So the UV will tile from the very bottom and repeat upwards along my mesh. Okay, so how do we get this thing to animate? Well, if you notice, as a little bit of a precursor, that when I move this UV, it seemingly is animating. What's actually happening is that the UV coordinates are moving, and then that's being represented by the movement in the texture. Okay, well, we can actually do that in the opposite way by technically moving moving our UV placement, basically. So instead of having to animate this little island, we can actually set up the texture to animate directly. So how do we do that? Well, firstly, let me just quickly make sure that everything's in place for mine. Looks like it's about right. Okay. Now, if I go to my hypershade, so if you open up your hypershade and take a look at our material. So I got my new material here. I'm going to push Graph Network so I can see it clearly. You'll notice that a few things are created when you make a text, you add a texture to your material. One is the texture file, and two is this little node here. Notice how there's a few attributes on that node that connects to our escalator or our texture file. If you look here, there's a little option for repeating our UV, so that's basically the scale of our UVs. But underneath here, there's also an option for offset. So look what happens when I start offsetting the UV in a specific direction. So if I go, I'm just going to bring that down a little bit. If I start playing with this value, say 0.5, the UV shifts. It's not scaling, it's literally just moving along the V axis of our UV map. I would show you how that looks with the other way, but because we have such a simple repeating tile, you probably won't notice a difference. But if I give it again, another value, 0.7, it's going to move again. So we can technically simply keyframe this, for instance, and have it animate. But if you feel like the need to, say, edit those keyframes, you'd have to go back into the hypershade, delete the keyframes, and re-input your values, and then go into the graph editor and then change the speed or the way it's easing and stuff like that. And on an animation aspect, that's a real pain in the ass. So we can actually make a control that links up to this value, thus giving us extra sort of, I guess, an easier way to edit that speed and that motion. So to do that, let's quickly just make a simple control. So in Maya, we used NURBS curves as controls. A simple NURBS circle will do for this one. So I'm going to make a NURBS circle. I'm going to bring that down here. And then I need to actually add an attribute to this thing. I have to add a switch of sorts that will allow me to edit the UV placement of my texture. So to do that, I select my NURBS curve. I go to Edit. I push Add Attribute, and then you'll see this window pop up. So all you need to add really is a name. So in this case, I'm going to call it escalator tile. You can give it a nice name. Essentially, what a nice name is that it adds a space to the image, to the name itself, so it looks a bit nicer in your channel box. I'm going to give this a float. So basically, the different functions allow, these different options allow for different ways of adding switches, but for us, it's going to be the default, so float. And because we're not going to have a minimum value or a maximum value, we can just leave that as nothing. And I'm going to push add. Notice how now I have a little box where I can input values. But right now, obviously, because I have nothing attached to this value, if I start increasing or decreasing the number, nothing's happening. Notice how nothing's happening. That's because I need to connect this value to the value of my UV offset. And that's a pretty simple process. So first thing I'm going to do before I move on to that, I'm going to click on my curve, and I'm going to freeze the transforms of all these values here. I'm going to give this a new name. I'm going to call this texture animate, or control text animate. And then I'm gonna first freeze those transforms and lock them. So with this control, I don't want to accidentally move it around. I just want to keep it near my escalator texture. So I'm going to lock the values. So therefore, when I start trying to edit it, nothing's going to happen. Now, how do we get this escalator tile value to match our texture offset value? So that's a pretty simple affair. We select our circle. I'm going to go to my Windows, General Editors, and then I'm going to go to my connection editor. So the connection editor should be here. Here it is. Connection editor. I'm going to open it up. Because I selected my curve, it's already given me the inputs and outputs of that control. So basically, see how I have this escalator tile node here? Basically, I can just connect this directly to this output, this place 2D texture node. So if I click this 2D texture node and come up here and push reload right, it brings up the options. Now, it's maybe a little bit confusing for the first time trying this out, but just bear with me. So obviously, if you look at these options here, they are matching our attributes of our 2D texture here. Basically, I need to connect this escalator tile value to this number here, this offset value here. See? Now, to do that, you have to understand what these values mean. So these values represent the U and the V value of our texture. So in the texture space, it's like X, Y, Z, but in a 2D sense. So basically, U is one direction and V is another direction. With our texture, we don't need to bother about offsetting our U value. We just have to change our V value. So to do that, we click on our escalator tile, and you'll see that because I have this selected, it gives me options of what I can use to select. Obviously, offset is grayed out because it can't directly influence two values at the same time. But if I click on the little plus icon, you'll see that I have the availability to directly link my escalator tile value to my offset V value. So if I click this offset V value with this selected already, they go italicized, and you'll see that the little value there turns yellow, meaning that there's an input connection. It's getting there's a relationship between our escalator tile value and our offset V value. Now, if I minimize these controls now, or these windows, sorry, and I select my control, you'll see now that when I start changing the value, it starts animating. And that's all you need to do to animate textures, basically. So now, here's a little trick to get this thing to loop. If I give this a value of 0, I'm going to keyframe that value here, key it there, and now I'm going to give this, next value at frame 30, for instance. I'm going to give this a value of 1. Ignore the animation up there. I'm not actually, that's from my previous file. We're just animating this one here. If I give it a value of 1, and it will automatically keyframe because I have automatic keyframe turned on, and I start scrubbing along my timeline, you'll see I have animation in that file. I'm going to hide that for a second. You'll see that I'll have animation there. Few issues here. So if you want this thing to loop, notice that if I push play and it's animating, it's only going to frame 30 and it's stopping. Secondly, you'll notice that the texture is moving, but it's accelerating and then it's slowing down. If you want it to loop, you want it to be constant. So we can do that in the graph editor. Now this is a lot easier to do now because we have a control that has this value. So instead of having to go into our graph editor, into our hypershade, selecting our node and then going to the graph editor, I now have a very easily accessible control that will allow me to edit those parameters that will allow me to loop. So let's do that now. I'll go to my Windows, I'm going to go to Animation Editors, and I'm going to go to Graph Editor. Now, notice how, because I have this control selected, I have my control here and my animation keyframes already visible in the graph editor. Now notice again, as I play this video, as I play this playback, it starts slow, it increases in speed, and then it slows down again and stops. Now if we want this thing to loop, we have to select our keyframes. We're going to go to keys. Let's have a look. We're going to go to view. We're going to turn on infinity. Turn that on. So you'll see these little handles go along the path. Second thing we need to do is linearize this motion. So to do that, we push this button here, linear tangents. So basically, instead of having these little Beziers that ease in and ease out of animation, we linearize it. Basically, it's in a straight constant line. So if I play that back now, there's no more acceleration. It's just a constant movement. Now, the only thing left to do now is make this work for infinity and keep it looping along. So to do that, I'm going to select my keys. I'm going to go to curves, post infinity, cycle with offset. And I'll do that in pre-infinity, cycle with offset as well. So no, post infinity is any animation after the last keyframe you've added, and pre-infinity is any keyframe you've got at the start, the very first keyframe you've got in your animation. So now, if I play that back, it's looping in infinity. So it's only glitching at the end because I've run out of frames of my composition. So if I add even more frames down here, say 250, actually let's give that a multiple of 30 since it's on 30 frames. Let's go 240 then. You'll get a constant loop there then. Notice how it's a constant loop, and it's keeping on going until the end, and then it repeats. Now I can increase the speed of this loop by just moving this keyframe, my last keyframe. I can make it faster or slower. So by holding down shift and selecting my keyframe, I'll get these little arrows, and I can slide that to be closer or further away from my original keyframe. And you'll notice that because it's closer to my first keyframe, it's looping faster. If I select that keyframe again and move it across to say frame 90, it's going to loop at a crawl. So that's much more manageable than going into your hypershade, moving those bloody node values, and then editing them as you go along. Now you can have them attached to a single control and basically just allowed to animate. So that's all you need to do to animate a texture. I'd say give it a go. If you need something like this, give it a go. And yeah, good luck with it. Thanks.